Podcast number 2. The Rupununi Uprising. In the early hours of January 2, 1969, in and around the town of Lethem, an armed rebellion was about to explode into action. This was Guyana, a former British colony, a newly independent nation, barely a few years old, and this plot was to go down in the annals of history as the Rupununi Uprising. Hi there, and welcome once again to Forgotten Stories from Guyana and the Caribbean with me, Aaron Darcy. Thanks for joining me on this journey through time as we explore some of the events that shaped the history of Guyana and the Caribbean. Today we look at the Rupununi Uprising, a notable event in the history of Guyana. I must have been about 12 years old, and I can recall hearing my dad and big brothers talking about this and catching some news on Radio Demerara, as the event was evolving. This was during Christmas 1968. Families were still very much in the holiday mood, enjoying seasonal music on the radio, eating pepper pot and bread for breakfast. Christmas curtains and decorations were still up and Christmas trees remained bright and shiny, because this was Christmas time in Guyana. But as the hours went by, this mood was interrupted by reports of some sort of trouble in Lethem. We all felt that something serious was happening. Here is what we eventually learned. Earlier that day, a DC-3 airplane, filled with a cargo of beef, was just about to take off from the Lethem airstrip when rebels fired upon it with a bazooka and machine guns. But the brave and skillful Captain Roland de Silva managed to evade the shots, lifted off and headed for the coast. This is how news of the actual uprising reached the authorities in the capital. In the meantime, those who had attacked the plane, now armed with weapons supplied by a neighboring country, took control of the settlement of Lethem, a small town located near the border with Brazil and Venezuela. The rebels locked up the district commissioner and his staff inside the town's abattoir, and in the following hours 5 policemen from the local outpost were killed and several residents were injured while bravely defending against this uprising. The 5 police officers were Constables James Mackenzie, William Norton, Michael Kendall, Sergeant James Anderson and Inspector Whittington Braithwaite. They, along with 2 civilians, Victor Hernandez and Thomas James, were killed while the rebels destroyed buildings belonging to the Guyanese government using bazookas and machine guns. The New York Times later reported a total of 9 fatalities. Rumors about a planned insurrection had been circulating for a while in that lightly populated area of Guyana, but only reached the ears of the new administration in Georgetown as it was actually unfolding, though not everybody living there was involved. But credit must be given to the plotters. They knew that in the city, people would still be hung over from celebrating Christmas and New Year's Day, and would be totally unprepared to think about, much less respond to this uprising. They would soon be proven wrong. The Rupununi then was a sparsely populated area, mostly inhabited by indigenous peoples and a few well-established cattle ranchers, and it was inside of one of the larger ranch houses that the scheme was hatched. The ranchers, it seemed, were afraid that their land rights were about to be revoked by the newly elected government that came to power after the 1968 elections. In this air of uncertainty and not a little disdainful of the makeup of the new administration in Georgetown, this group of ranchers decided that they would secede from Guyana and form a separate state covering some 22,000 square miles. But Guyanese, including those in the government, were still blindfolded by politically motivated racial strife to be even aware, much less concerned by what was happening a world away in the Rupununi. And after all, it was still Christmas time and everybody was in a state of unpreparedness for this kind of event. The ranchers' plan was to control the Rupununi region for 3 days, after which the plotters assumed they would get recognition and support from the Venezuelan government. Planning for the rebellion had involved just a small group of about 100 individuals in order to ensure secrecy. Those Amerindians who were drafted into the scheme were employees of the ranchers and so had little or no choice in the matter. Just a short time before, the Guyanese Agriculture Minister Robert Jordan had advised that the government would not recognize the Rupununi ranchers' land ownership certificates. It was rumored that the vast stretches of grazing lands would be redistributed to indigenous peoples and to others from among the Afro and Indo-Guyanese population. Some developers from Jamaica and Barbados were also said to start projects in the area. As a matter of fact, the Guyanese government was in the process of creating a commission that would issue land certificates to indigenous families in the area. This was a strategically bad move by the young administration. Had they befriended these ranchers, then much of the day's drama could have been avoided. But here it was, trouble beginning in a part of Guyana that was at one end of the map, while the seat of government and the armed forces were in the capital at the other end. The leadership of the new nation should have tried to embrace those that knew and controlled the Rupununi District, but instead had foolishly made enemies of them. In all fairness to these ranchers, though, it might be argued that while their use of vast stretches of these savannas appeared to be wasteful, cattle ranching does require a lot of land for grazing, and perhaps those in the government did not appreciate this. So, with the fear of losing their lands and livelihoods, the ranchers decided that they would declare the Rupununi to be a separate state. They sought and were given support by the then government of Venezuela, because it seemed that they had come to loggerheads with the Guyana government. The Venezuelans, of course, were quite willing to help the rebel ranchers. Back then and for decades before, the Venezuelan claim to almost two-thirds of Guyana was very much alive, and they saw this as an opportunity to seize that part of Guyana, which they had always claimed as theirs. This claim is still being used today to benefit several very interested and powerful parties. And so from among the ranchers and their ranch hands, almost 100 of them were transported to bases inside Venezuela, where they received military training and were given arms and ammunition. After about 2 weeks of this training, the rebels returned to the Rupununi by clandestine after dark flights. So as the hours progressed on January 2, 1969, and as news of this rebellion reached Georgetown, the Guyana Defense Force was called upon to defend Guyana. Getting troops into the Rupununi would be difficult, as the newly formed GDF had no aerial wing just yet. But gallantry was still alive in this country, and a few civilian pilots from the Guyana Airways and their aircraft were drafted into service. The pilots were eager to be a part of the mission. Names like Jardam and Chana Su would go down in history, as two of these pilots who without any reservation accepted the request to fly troops into battle. The Army's plan was to land the troops at Manari airstrip, from where an attempt would be made to retake control of the situation. At about 5 p.m. that same day, 2 planes took off from Timeri and headed southwards to Manari in the Rupununi. On board the 2 aircraft were some 75 highly trained and very capable British and Guyanese troops along with their supplies. The idea was to arrive at the drop-off point just about sunset, while there was enough light to land and enough darkness to cover their movements. They arrived over Manari airstrip shortly after 6 p.m. and as previously arranged, a friendly party was at one end of the darkened runway, and flashing vehicle headlights signaled that it was safe to land, and so the first plane touched down. But as the second one approached for landing, there was the sound of rapid gunfire, and the commander of the troops below radioed the second pilot that there were hostile elements in the area. The second aircraft overshot the first end of the landing strip and touched down at the far end instead. The 50 troops swiftly disembarked and returned fire to the enemy. The GDF, within just a few hours, subdued the rebels, and most of those that had spearheaded this revolution hastily abandoned their weapons, possessions and properties and took off across the border into Venezuela. The GDF, following instructions, burned the ranches and other properties belonging to those that had engaged in the rebellion. Some people would afterwards complain that this was totally unnecessary, but the military felt that this would give the rebels little or no reason to return, and would prevent them from recouping and trying the same thing again. This proved true, as members of those rebel families stayed in Venezuela and were later granted citizenship in that country. A very strict policy was afterwards put in place, which only allowed visitors to the area after they had applied and were granted permission. The events of January 2, 1969 were prevented from escalating into an actual war because of the influence of Britain and the US, and it is believed that the power of this influence still holds strong in modern times. Hopefully the events of that day served to awaken some sense of awareness in the then new nation, of the dangers posed by the Western neighbor. I know that in my home and village of Kitty, we were ecstatic over the fact that our own GDF had put down a rebellion in the Rupununi, and we celebrated accordingly. Later that same year, the very shaky new Guyanese nation faced another incursion onto its territory, this time from its eastern neighbor, Suriname. More of that and other notable events in our history as we continue to revisit our past and rediscover our identity as Guyanese. I look forward to sharing much more with you in the next episode of Forgotten Stories from Guyana and the Caribbean with Aaron Darcy. Goodbye for now.